"Ma'am, maybe if you people moved a little faster, the rest of us wouldn't have to wait," the officer said, his voice cutting through the low hum of clinking silverware and quiet conversations like a blade across glass. And for a split second, the entire diner seemed to freeze, forks hovering midair, coffee cups paused halfway to lips, every pair of eyes slowly turning toward the sound without anyone daring to speak, because tension has a way of filling a room before anyone understands why. And right there, standing beneath the soft yellow glow of overhead lights that flickered faintly against polished chrome and checkered tile floors, Maya Williams stood still with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, her shoulders slightly tense but her posture upright, her name tag catching the light as if it were trying to remind the world that she was more than just a uniform, more than just a role, more than just the quiet presence people overlooked when they wanted something fast and cheap and immediate. And yet the weight of the moment pressed down on her like the heavy Florida humidity outside, thick and inescapable, her breath steady but shallow as the faint smell of fried food and fresh coffee wrapped around her like a memory she couldn't quite leave behind, and she lowered the tray gently onto the edge of the counter, careful not to let it rattle, careful not to give anyone a reason to say she was careless, slow, or anything else they had already decided she was before she ever spoke a word. And across from her stood Officer Ryan Cole, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming under the light, fingers resting near his belt in a posture that suggested authority without ever needing to announce it, his eyes scanning her not with curiosity, but with judgment already formed, already settled, as if he had seen this moment play out 100 times before and already knew how it would end. And maybe that was what made it worse, not the words themselves, not even the tone, but the certainty behind them. The quiet assumption that she would shrink, apologize, step back into whatever invisible space he believed she belonged in, and somewhere near the window, a man coughed softly. The sound too loud in the silence that followed, while a couple in the corner exchanged a glance and quickly looked away, their discomfort hanging in the air like something unspoken but understood, because everyone in that room felt it, that subtle shift, that invisible line drawn between power and dignity, between who gets to speak and who is expected to listen, and Maya's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in anger, not in defiance, but in control, the kind of control you learn over years of swallowing words, of choosing peace over escalation, of surviving moments exactly like this without letting them take something from you that you can never get back. And the overhead light flickered once more, casting a brief shadow across her face, highlighting the calm in her eyes. The kind of calm that isn't born from weakness but from something deeper, something steadier. Something that refuses to break even when the world quietly dares it to. And in that silence, thick and unmoving, you could almost hear the building itself holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. The seconds stretched just long enough for memory to slip in, quiet and uninvited, the kind that did not ask permission but arrived anyway, and Maya felt it the way she always did, not as a distraction, but as an anchor, something steady beneath her feet when everything else tilted, because this was not the first time a room had turned cold around her. Not the first time someone had looked past her name, and seen only a role they believed she should stay inside, and years earlier, in a small apartment that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender oil, her mother had sat by the window wrapped in a thin blanket, sunlight cutting across her face in soft, golden lines while the sound of traffic hummed somewhere far below, and she had said it so simply it almost sounded like nothing at all. Stay kind even when they are not as a suggestion, not as weakness, but as something stronger, something harder. Something that took more courage than raising your voice or walking away. And Maya had carried that with her through double shifts that stretched past midnight, through mornings when her alarm went off after only 4 hours of sleep, through tips that barely covered rent and days when her hands trembled from exhaustion while she still managed to balance trays with quiet precision, because kindness was not soft, it was disciplined, it was deliberate, it was something you chose over and over again even when the world made it difficult, and now standing there in the diner, she could feel that same quiet discipline settling into her shoulders, grounding her, while the faint buzz of a neon sign outside flickered through the front window and painted a restless glow across the floor, and behind the counter, the coffee machine hissed softly, releasing a thin stream of steam that curled upward and disappeared into the air, unnoticed by anyone except her, because she noticed everything, the small things, the details people ignored when they were too busy rushing or judging or assuming. And her apron pocket brushed lightly against her hip where her phone rested. The screen still showing a message she had read only minutes earlier, a confirmation from the pharmacy that the payment had gone through, another small victory, another quiet relief that her mother would have what she needed for at least another week, and that mattered more than this moment, more than the stares, more than the tension pressing against her chest, and yet she could still feel every eye in the room. Could still sense the way people shifted in their seats, the subtle scrape of chairs against tile, the quiet murmur that never quite formed into words, because no one wanted to be the first to speak, no one wanted to step into something that did not belong to them, and that silence, heavier than any noise, settled between her and the officer like a line drawn in the air, clear and unmistakable, and she inhaled slowly, the scent of coffee and grease filling her lungs, steadying her heartbeat, reminding her that she was still here, still present, still in control of the only thing that truly mattered in moments like this, herself. And when she lifted her gaze again, it was not defiant, not challenging, but clear, steady, and unshaken, the kind of look that did not ask for permission to exist, but simply did quietly, firmly, without apology. Officer Ryan Coles shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his duty belt creaking in the quiet as his gaze remained fixed on Maya, not searching, not questioning, but asserting, as if the space itself belonged to him and everyone inside it had already agreed without saying a word, and the overhead lights reflected faintly off the polished badge on his chest, a small glint that seemed to pulse with authority each time he moved, while his jaw tightened just enough to signal impatience, the kind that builds when someone does not respond the way you expect them to, and he exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath that carried more meaning than volume, because silence, when held by someone in power, can feel louder than shouting, and he leaned forward just slightly, not enough to close the distance, but enough to remind her that he could, that he controlled how close or far things could go. And the subtle shift did not go unnoticed by the people around them, a woman near the counter lowering her eyes to her plate, a man by the door pretending to scroll through his phone while his thumb remained still against the screen, frozen in place, and somewhere behind Maya, the manager stood near the kitchen entrance, arms crossed tightly across his chest, not stepping forward, not stepping in, just watching, calculating, as if weighing inconvenience against intervention and deciding, quietly, to remain still. And that choice hung in the air just as heavily as anything the officer had said, because absence, in moments like this, speaks its own language, and Maya felt it, not as surprise, but as confirmation, another quiet reminder of how easily people step back when something uncomfortable begins to unfold. And Officer Cole's voice came again, lower this time, more measured, but carrying the same edge beneath it, asking how long it really takes to bring a simple order. The words stretched just enough to suggest more than they stated, and his eyes flicked briefly to the empty table, then back to her, as if presenting evidence in a case he had already decided, and Maya followed that glance for only a fraction of a second, just long enough to acknowledge it, before returning her focus to him, steady and unshaken, her hands now resting lightly against the edge of the counter, fingers relaxed, not gripping, not defensive, just present, and the hum of the diner slowly began to creep back in at the edges, the faint clatter of dishes, the low murmur of voices trying to resume normalcy without fully committing to it. As if the room itself was unsure whether it was allowed to move again, and outside, a car passed along the street, tires brushing against pavement with a soft hiss that slipped through the glass and faded quickly, leaving the moment intact, suspended, and in that narrow space between expectation and response, between pressure and choice, Maya stood grounded, her breathing even, her gaze clear, holding on to something deeper than the moment itself, something that did not bend simply because someone expected it to. And for the first time, there was the slightest pause in the officer's expression, not doubt, not yet, but a flicker, brief and almost imperceptible, as if the outcome he anticipated was taking longer to arrive than he was used to, and that delay, that quiet resistance without words, began to shift the air in a way no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. The words came quietly, almost too soft to belong in a room that had been holding so much tension, yet they carried with them a weight that settled into every corner of the diner as Maya finally spoke, her voice steady, measured, and unmistakably clear as she said that wearing a badge does not give anyone the right to treat people without respect, and for a brief moment, it felt as if even the air itself paused to listen, the low hum of conversation fading once again into a silence that was no longer uncertain, but focused, drawn tightly around the space between them like a line that had just been made visible. And Officer Cole's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough that the certainty in his posture wavered ever so slightly, his shoulders stiffening as if the response he had anticipated had been replaced by something he did not immediately know how to counter, and his eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in calculation, as though reassessing a situation that had just slipped outside of his control in a way he had not expected. And behind Maya, the manager shifted his stance, uncrossing and then crossing his arms again, his weight moving from one foot to the other in a quiet display of discomfort, still choosing distance over involvement. While a woman near the window lifted her gaze just enough to watch openly now, no longer pretending not to see, and a man at the counter set his coffee down with a soft clink that echoed louder than it should have, the sound punctuating the moment like a marker of change, because something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, and Maya remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly against the counter, her breathing even as she held his gaze without challenge. Without fear, just presence, and that presence carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it did not seek to overpower, it did not demand, it simply existed with a quiet strength that refused to be dismissed, and the light above them flickered once again, casting brief shadows that moved across their faces and disappeared just as quickly, as if even the room itself could not fully settle on what it was witnessing, and Officer Cole let out a short breath, his jaw tightening as he straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as though re-establishing his authority through posture alone, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of his belt in a small, habitual motion that suggested control, routine, certainty. Yet the pause before he spoke again lingered just long enough to reveal that something in this exchange had not followed the script he was used to, and in that pause, in that space where expectation had been quietly disrupted, Maya stood grounded, her words still hanging in the air not as a challenge, but as a truth that did not need to be repeated to be understood, and for the first time since the moment began, the balance in the room no longer leaned entirely in one direction, but hovered somewhere in between, fragile, shifting, and uncertain of where it would land next. The moment did not break, it tightened, like a thread pulled too far but not yet snapping, and Officer Cole's expression hardened as if the room itself had challenged him instead of the woman standing calmly in front of him, his lips pressing into a thin line while his gaze sharpened, searching for something he could use to reassert the balance that had quietly shifted away from him. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a cooler edge. Less about impatience now and more about control. Asking if she was refusing to comply, the words stretched just enough to carry weight beyond their surface, and a faint murmur rippled through the diner, subtle but unmistakable, as if the people watching could feel the stakes rising without fully understanding where they would land. And behind Maya, the manager finally stepped forward a half pace, not enough to stand beside her, but enough to make his presence known. His voice low and careful as he suggested that maybe it would be best to smooth things over, to keep the situation from escalating, his words aimed at her rather than the officer, because it was easier that way, safer, and Maya heard it, felt it, the quiet pressure to bend, to apologize, to restore a version of peace that came at her expense, and for a brief second, her eyes flickered toward him, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of understanding that settled deeper than either, because she had seen this before, the way people chose comfort over courage, the way silence disguised itself as neutrality, and she turned back to Officer Cole, her posture still steady, her breathing unchanged, the rhythm of it grounding her as the room seemed to lean in again, waiting, watching, and the overhead lights cast a soft glow across her face, highlighting the calm that had not cracked, the presence that had not shifted, and she spoke again, her voice still even, still controlled. saying that she was doing her job and that she would continue to do it with respect, but that respect was not something that could be one-sided, and the words landed without force yet carried a clarity that could not be easily dismissed, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The clatter of dishes stilled once more as if the diner itself had chosen to listen, and Officer Cole's hand hovered briefly near his belt again, not grasping, not reaching, just resting there in a gesture that had once signaled certainty but now felt slightly delayed, slightly uncertain, and his eyes held hers longer than before, as if trying to determine whether this calm was real or simply a pause before submission, and when it did not break, when it did not waver, something in his stance shifted again, subtle but visible to those paying attention, and the space between them grew heavier, filled not with noise, but with the weight of a moment that refused to resolve the way it was expected to, and in that space, Maya remained grounded, her presence steady against the rising pressure, her silence now as powerful as her words, holding the line not with force, but with something far stronger, something that did not need permission to exist. The tension did not explode, it settled, heavy and slow, like humidity before a storm that never quite arrives, and in that suspended quiet, something deeper began to surface, not in the officer, not in the room, but in the stillness Maya carried within herself, the kind of stillness that is not empty but full, layered with years of restraint, patience, and choices made when no one was watching, and her gaze did not drop, did not harden, it simply remained, steady and present, while the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above flickered softly, casting a pale glow that seemed almost too harsh for a moment this quiet, and somewhere behind her, a plate was set down gently, the sound careful, controlled, as if even the smallest noise might disturb whatever fragile balance had formed, and Maya's fingers shifted slightly against the counter, not gripping, not retreating, just adjusting, grounding herself in the physical world as her breath moved in slow, even rhythm, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the kind of breathing that carries intention, that keeps something inside from breaking loose, and her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, not away from the officer, but through him, past the badge, past the uniform, as if seeing something beyond the surface, something human, something flawed, something that perhaps had never been questioned before. And that quiet recognition did not come with anger, it came with clarity, and that clarity softened something in her expression, not weakness, but understanding, the kind that refuses to mirror the same harshness placed upon it. And the room felt it, even if no one could name it, the way the energy shifted from confrontation to something heavier, something reflective, the way a few people slowly straightened in their seats, no longer shrinking from the moment, but leaning into it, witnessing it. And the manager, still standing just behind her, lowered his arms slightly, his posture loosening as uncertainty replaced his earlier calculation, and Officer Cole remained where he was. But the sharpness in his stance dulled just enough to reveal something underneath, a hesitation that had not been there before, a pause that stretched longer than authority usually allowed, and Maya spoke again, her voice quieter now, but carrying further somehow, saying that everyone has a choice in how they treat others, even in moments of frustration, even in moments of power, and that choice defines more than any uniform ever could, and the words did not strike, they settled, sinking into the space between them, and no one interrupted. No one laughed, no one dismissed it, because something about the way she said it, the calm, the steadiness, the absence of fear, made it impossible to ignore, and in that stillness, the sound of a car passing outside returned again, softer this time, like a reminder that the world beyond this diner continued to move, even as everything inside remained suspended in a moment that felt larger than it should have been, and Maya stood there, not as someone waiting for permission, not as someone asking for validation, but as someone fully present in her own dignity, holding onto it without force, without demand, simply refusing to let it be taken, and that quiet refusal, that calm, unwavering presence, began to reshape the space around her in a way no raised voice ever could. The shift did not announce itself with sound, it arrived in silence, in the subtle change of posture at the entrance as the diner door opened with a soft chime that barely registered at first, just another customer stepping in from the late afternoon heat, the warm air following him briefly before the door eased shut behind him, and for a moment, no one paid attention. Because all eyes were still anchored to the space between Maya and Officer Cole, still held by the tension that had not yet resolved. But the man who entered did not rush, did not hesitate either, his steps measured, steady, the kind of pace that suggested awareness without urgency, and as he moved forward, the light from the front windows caught the edge of his frame, outlining him in a way that made his presence quietly noticeable without demanding attention, and he paused just inside, taking in the room with a single glance, not scanning for threat, not searching for dominance, but observing, absorbing, as if reading the air itself. And there was something about that stillness, that awareness, that began to ripple outward, subtle at first, like a shift in pressure that only a few could feel, and one of the customers near the door glanced up, then another, their expressions tightening slightly as recognition flickered across their faces without being spoken, while the manager's posture straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back as if responding to something he did not fully understand yet. And Maya did not turn immediately, did not break the line she held, but something in the room changed around her, something that reached her before she even saw it, the way silence can carry information before words ever do, and Officer Cole noticed it too, not through sight at first, but through instinct, his gaze flicking briefly past Maya toward the entrance, just a fraction of a second. Enough to register that the room's attention had begun to divide, and when his eyes returned to her, there was a slight delay, a hesitation that had not been there before, and the man took another step forward, then another, until he stood just within the edge of the scene, not interrupting, not inserting himself, simply present, and he spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm clarity that cut through the tension without breaking it, asking a simple question about whether everything was all right here, the kind of question that did not accuse, did not escalate, but demanded acknowledgement. And the room responded to it in ways no one could quite explain, the air shifting again, heavier in a different way now. Less about pressure and more about awareness, and Officer Cole turned. Fully this time, his body angling slightly as he faced the newcomer, his expression tightening once more, but not in the same way as before. This time there was calculation layered beneath it, recognition forming slowly, as if a memory was aligning with the man standing in front of him. And the silence that followed stretched longer than expected, long enough for the weight of that recognition to settle into the space between them, altering it, reshaping it, and Maya finally turned, her eyes meeting the man's for the first time, and there was no surprise in her expression, only a quiet understanding, as if this moment, like everything else, had arrived exactly when it was meant to, and in that shared glance, something unspoken passed between them, not a signal, not a command, but a connection rooted deeper than the moment itself, and the balance in the room, already shifting, tipped just slightly further. No longer uncertain, but moving towards something that could not be undone. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into something heavier than tension, something closer to truth waiting to be acknowledged, and the man stood there without moving any closer, his presence steady, his gaze calm but unwavering as it rested on Officer Cole. Not with challenge, not with aggression, but with a clarity that left no room for dismissal, and when he spoke again, his voice remained even, measured. Asking what had happened here, not demanding, not accusing, simply placing the moment into the open where it could no longer hide behind assumption or authority, and Officer Cole straightened slightly, his posture adjusting as if instinctively reclaiming ground, but the delay in his response lingered just long enough to reveal the shift that had already taken place, and his eyes flickered briefly to the man's face, then to his stance, taking in details he had missed before, the composure, the quiet control, the kind that does not come from position but from experience, and something in that recognition settled into him, not fully formed yet, but enough to slow him down. Enough to pull him out of the certainty he had been standing in moments ago, and behind him, the room had gone completely still again, not out of fear this time, but attention, focused and intentional, as if everyone present understood that the moment had crossed into something else entirely, and Maya remained where she was, her presence unchanged, her gaze no longer fixed on the officer but shared between the two men, calm and steady, as if she were no longer carrying the weight of the moment alone, and the manager, who had stayed carefully on the edge of everything, now lowered his arms completely, his stance softening in a way that mirrored the room itself, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, and Officer Cole finally spoke, his voice controlled but lacking the sharp edge it once carried, explaining that there had been a delay in service, that he had addressed it, his words carefully chosen now, trimmed down, as if aware that they were being heard differently than before. And the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, absorbing the explanation without reacting to it immediately, and when the officer finished, there was a brief pause, a space where the weight of what had not been said hung just as heavily as what had, and then the man nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging the words without accepting them at face value, and his gaze shifted, just slightly, toward Maya, not asking her to speak, not placing pressure on her to confirm or deny, but recognizing her presence in a way that restored something that had been overlooked earlier, and when his eyes returned to Officer Cole, there was a subtle change, not in intensity, but in certainty, as if whatever understanding had been forming had now settled into place, and he spoke again, quietly, stating that respect is not optional, not situational, and not something that changes based on who is watching, and the words landed differently now, not as resistance, but as truth, clear and undeniable. And for the first time, Officer Cole's gaze dropped, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to break the line he had held since the beginning, and in that small movement, that quiet shift, something in the room released, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, as if a pressure had finally eased, and Maya stood there, unchanged, her dignity intact, her calm unshaken, not because someone had stepped in for her, but because she had never stepped away from herself in the first place. The moment did not end with a loud resolution, it softened, like a wave pulling back from the shore after pressing in just enough to leave its mark, and Officer Cole stood there for a second longer than expected, his shoulders no longer squared with the same rigid certainty, his gaze lowered just enough to signal that something inside him had shifted, even if he did not have the words to name it, and without another remark, without any attempt to reclaim the ground he had lost, he adjusted his stance once more and stepped back, the movement small but unmistakable, creating space where there had once been pressure, and as he turned toward the door, the faint jingle above it sounded again, softer this time, less like an interruption and more like a quiet release, and the warm air from outside slipped in briefly before the door closed behind him, leaving the diner wrapped in a different kind of silence, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if the room itself was processing what had just unfolded, and for a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, the clatter of dishes paused, conversations suspended, until slowly, almost carefully, life began to return, a fork lifting, a chair shifting, the coffee machine hissing softly once more, each small sound rebuilding the normal rhythm piece by piece, and Maya remained where she was, her hands still resting lightly against the counter, her breathing steady, her expression calm, not triumphant, not relieved, just present, as if the moment had passed through her without taking anything away, and beside her, the man who had stepped in did not linger with expectation, did not draw attention to himself, he simply looked at her, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, something unspoken but understood, and he gave a slight nod, the kind that did not seek recognition but offered respect, before turning his gaze briefly toward the room, as if ensuring that what needed to be seen had been seen, and then back to her, and in that exchange, there was no need for explanation, no need for names or titles, because what mattered had already been revealed, and Maya straightened just slightly, her shoulders easing as she reached for the tray she had set down earlier, her movements smooth, deliberate, returning to the task she had been doing before everything stopped, not because nothing had happened, but because she had chosen not to let it define the rest of her day, and the manager stepped closer now, his voice quieter than before, carrying a tone that had shifted from avoidance to something closer to respect, though still unsure, still finding its place, and Maya acknowledged him with a simple nod, nothing more, no words needed, because the moment had already said enough, and as she moved toward the next table, the light from the front windows stretched across the floor in long, warm lines. Catching briefly on her name tag again, reflecting a small glint that seemed brighter now, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something deeper had settled into place, and the diner continued on, conversations resuming, plates clinking, the ordinary rhythm of life returning, yet carrying with it a quiet imprint of what had been witnessed, a reminder that dignity does not need to be raised to be powerful, that kindness does not need to yield to be strong, and that sometimes the most lasting form of justice arrives not in noise or spectacle, but in the stillness that follows when truth has been seen and cannot be unseen.